My name is Adam Hollowell. I'm one of the instructors for the Geary course this semester, and I'm also a research associate at the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. The Geary course is cross-listed in multiple departments and listed at both the graduate and the undergraduate level. So it's a course that facilitates integrated study and research across fields of social, historical, and political inequality. The Geary seminar also rotates themes every semester, and past semesters have included courses on reparations, genetics and neuroscience, athletes and activism, social determinants of health. And this fall semester, the seminar class has addressed themes of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre in global perspective, which is also the topic of our events today. Earlier this year, we passed the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which took place on the evening of May 31st and into the morning of June 1st, 1921. Many events have commemorated this 100th anniversary in recent months. 3 documentary films on the topics of Tulsa and the Greenwood District were released earlier this year. Late historian John Hope Franklin and Scott Ellsworth, a Duke PhD, also wrote the introduction for a new publication of the first written account of the massacre by Mary E. Jones Parrish, which is titled The Nation Must Awake, and this was one of our assigned texts for the students this semester. The Cook Center at Duke has dedicated our efforts to commemorating the massacre in teaching, research, and writing throughout the year. In just a moment, we'll unveil a new report, Oil and Blood, The Color of Wealth in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the fall Geary course, students explored inequalities through the events of the 1921 massacre, the global economic and racial contexts of early 20th century violence, as well as the massacre's influence on art, literature, social scientific research, and American culture. Guest lecturers joined the course from Tulsa and across the country via Zoom, including John Whittington Franklin, Vanessa Adams Harris, and Scott Ellsworth, which are names that many of you will recognize. The Geary course also invites students to produce a major research paper that will qualify for submission to a refereed journal in an area relevant to their course of study at Duke, and I'll also say at UNC, because we have a few UNC students who joined us this year through the interinstitutional course agreement. So later today, we'll hear research presentations from some of the undergraduate and graduate students who are enrolled in the Geary course. For the moment, however, we want to turn our attention back to the new report on the color of wealth in Tulsa. And to do that, I'd like to introduce and welcome Lindsay Foster Thomas, Content Director at WUNC, a multi-platform journalist and audio storyteller with a background in public radio. Thomas is a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism and Hampton University, and more recently, she hosted a podcast series titled The Arc of Justice for the Ways and Means podcast at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. So welcome to Lindsay Foster Thomas.
Thank you for that, Adam. Hey, y'all. Thank you for being here. And on a Monday, no less. As you heard, in just a few moments, we're going to have a conversation about how the events of a century ago still resonate today, and hopefully walk away from this event with some better understanding about that. I wish I remembered when I first heard of the 1921 massacre in Tulsa. I know it was not watching the HBO series Watchmen, but you know, I think I've noticed since that series debuted, and certainly in this anniversary year, more interest, more engagement around this topic. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce our first presenter today, Lauren Russell. At the intersection of poverty, inequality, race, and gender is where you will find the work of Lauren Russell. Her research interests lie in labor economics and public finance, with a focus on neighborhood sorting, neighborhood effects, and US housing policy. She earned a master's in economics from Duke University and a bachelor's in classics with a minor in economics from Harvard. She is currently a PhD candidate in public policy at Harvard and a visiting researcher at the Cook Center on Social Equity here at Duke. And she joins us now to present the latest report from the Color of Wealth series. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I had the sniffles from my mask. But good morning. My name is Lauren Russell, and as mentioned, I'm a research associate at the Cook Center and a current PhD student at Harvard. We're really excited to share with you this morning some new research conducted by the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center in collaboration with C. Ajan Lee, who is an assistant professor in regional and city planning at the University of Oklahoma, Randall Aki, who is an associate professor of public policy at UCLA, Professor Rafi Garcia, who's an assistant professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic University, and Professor Jorge Zumayeta, who's a professor of economics at Florida International University, and Professor William Derry, or Sandy as we call him, who is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics at Duke University. He is also the founding director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. The project that I'll be presenting today is titled Oil and Blood, The Color of Wealth in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and this serves as the final report in the Color of Wealth series. All right. So the goal of this report series is to document the economic well-being of people of color in 6 U.S. cities. And so the 6 cities that we've studied are Tulsa, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Boston, and Miami. All of these reports use survey data from the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color, which we call NASC. This survey collected detailed information on household income, earnings, debt, assets, and other financial activity at the household level across various racial ethnic groups in these cities. And unlike other surveys that collect this type of data, the NASC collects information for what we call racial ethnic groups instead of just racial groups. For Tulsa, we're going to present estimates for Blacks, whites, and specific Native American tribes. So why did we pick Tulsa? Well, Tulsa is the second largest city in the state of Oklahoma with a little over 400,000 residents. And Tulsa is also particularly interesting because of its history and its quick rise to an economic power hub at the turn of the 20th century. So the city was officially incorporated in 1898, and the first oil discovery happened in 1901. A series of subsequent oil discoveries then led to an explosive population growth in the form of newcomers seeking economic gain as a result of the oil boom. In 1900, there were only about 1,400 Tulsans, but 1 decade later, that number had grown to a little over 18,000 people. By 1930, Tulsa had become the oil capital of the nation, and various racial ethnic groups reaped the benefits of this economic boom. We also choose Tulsa because it has a sizable Native American population, which allows us to produce estimates for specific tribal nations. The Tulsa metropolitan area actually has the second highest percentage of individuals who self-identify with at least one federally recognized Native American tribe. Tulsa is also interesting because it's a relatively low-income city with about 19% of its residents living below the poverty line. The median income in Tulsa is $49,000, which is $13,000 lower than the national median. In terms of its racial composition, the city has a majority non-Hispanic white population, followed by Hispanics and Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, and then a combination of other groups which include Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders and multiracial individuals. Tulsa is also characterized by an unequal distribution of resources across racial ethnic groups and high levels of residential segregation. There are disparities in educational attainment, wealth, and income across these groups. And so in order to help us understand the origins of these disparities, I'll turn to a short historical overview of the various racial ethnic groups in Tulsa before we get into the details of the analysis that we did. So I'll begin with Native Americans. So Tulsa is located on what was once called Indian Territory that was home to various Native American tribes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to an influx of different Native American tribes into the area. Under this act, the U.S. government forcibly removed Native Americans from the East and relocated them to the Indian Territory. This was known as the Trail of Tears, and thousands of Native Americans were killed during this journey. During this time, Cherokee, Muskogee, also known as Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations entered Tulsa along with Blacks that they had enslaved. There's a long history of violence directed at Native Americans in Tulsa by whites, where the primary purpose was to seize control of Native American assets after the discovery of oil. especially land that had oil on it. Oh, and then I give an example. And so one such case of violence was actually something that happened to the Osage Nation. It was called the Reign of Terror, where there was a series of murders from 1910s to 1930s in an attempt to seize land. There were two flows of blacks into Tulsa. And so the first flow comes from enslaved blacks that were forced to migrate with Native American tribes during the Indian Removal Act. And the second wave was due to blacks immigrating from the southern states to seek economic gain due to the oil boom in the early 1900s. Each wave of black migration saw the establishment of a series of majority black neighborhoods throughout Oklahoma, one of which was the thriving business and residential district of Greenwood. There's a long history of violence directed towards blacks in Oklahoma. One of the worst cases of racial violence in the country was the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, where white mobs destroyed 35 blocks of black homes and businesses in Greenwood. The massacre resulted in an estimated 300 deaths and about 10,000 displaced persons. This massacre was a direct destruction of the economic gains of blacks. A recent paper, Albright et al. 2021, has found that this massacre led to a decrease in black home ownership and occupational status right after the massacre, and that the negative impact not only persisted until the end of the 20th century, but it actually widened over time, which means that the impact of this massacre can be seen in black wealth levels today. In addition to physical racial violence, blacks also faced racial segregation under Jim Crow in Oklahoma. So whites entered into Tulsa because of population pressures in surrounding states, and upon their arrival, they were able to take advantage of the Homestead Act, the first of which was in 1862, which allowed them to claim public lands as their own, provided that they live on the land for 5 years and made improvements to the land. These public lands were often taken at the expense of tribal lands. After emancipation, the notion of white identity developed and became deeply entrenched in Oklahoma, and this was fostered by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. There was a push across these groups to unite whites across social classes in order to keep in place the Jim Crow system, which disenfranchised blacks. In terms of the Hispanic population in Tulsa, this population has been relatively small until recent decades. It started with vaqueros and cowboys from Mexico immigrating to take advantage of the cattle trails to meet the increasing demand for beef. And then it was followed by more immigration from Mexico to find work in railroad development and coal mining. In the mid-20th century, there was an influx of Puerto Rican soldiers that were stationed at military bases in Oklahoma during World War II. This wave of immigration was then followed by Venezuelan immigrants in the 1970s for the petroleum industry. And in recent times, Hispanics have actually become the fastest growing ethnic group in Tulsa, with 51% of new immigrants coming from Latin America. Until 2007, Oklahoma seemed to be relatively inclusive of its immigrant population. However, anti-immigration sentiments have gained momentum in the 2000s, where we see that the state legislature has repealed several acts that were meant to help undocumented immigrants. And so to give you a little flavor of what we find in our report, so what we find is that there are statistically significant lower levels of wealth for blacks, Hispanics, and Muskogee Native Americans when compared to whites in the NASS data. We find that the largest wealth gap is between blacks and whites, and this seems to be driven mainly by differences in rates of home ownership and entrepreneurship, which is particularly interesting given historical circumstances. And we also find that a greater portion of the wealth gap between blacks and whites is unexplained than for any other racial ethnic group when controlling for demographic and other household characteristics. And so now I'll turn it over to Rocky to walk you through the data and methodology and results.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I would like to thank also the Cook Center for this opportunity. So today I'm tasked with going over the analysis part. And first, it is important to understand how and what type of data we obtain. Lauren did an amazing job in terms of describing the data. the data set. And what we ended up doing is obtaining the data from the NASC that was collected in 2012, and basically in the whole Tulsa MSA. So we collected detailed information about earnings, but also not only about, but also about the assets and also debts. So you have kind of like a more comprehensive picture of the households in Tulsa. So we include a different type of racial groups, whites, blacks, Hispanics, and then different tribes, Native American tribes. One of the limitations of the data set is that it is just a snapshot, it's a cross-section data, so we're not necessarily following the households. We just basically, at one point in time, kind of like understanding what the wealth and the different type of assets and debt that the household hold at that point in time. So as in any given survey, you would have obviously some households or individuals that might not answer some questions, so we have some missing data in some of the variables. So just keep that in mind as well. All right, so in terms of the methodology, what we decided to do is to investigate what is kind of like driving some of this inequality that we see in terms of wealth, income, and household income. We use the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition method, in which basically just a twofold decomposition in which we take the data and we control for some specific variables that we are able to control for, and then we divide the wealth gap into the explained and unexplained part. So you can imagine that if you are able to control for a lot of different things, then whatever is not necessarily the existence of the gap that you're not able to explain, then it basically says or serve as an evidence for discrimination, meaning that some other unobservables that we're not able to explain directly from the data. So in this case, that's basically the component that we're going to be focusing on in terms of determining the historical discrimination that has happened in Tulsa and that has contributed to this wealth gap. So just to give you a quick snapshot of what the data looks like, we have done this summary of statistics in which we have divided between all of the observations, all of the households, and then we have broken it down between whites, black, Hispanics, and Native Americans, and then we have taken the difference between relative to whites to identify where some of these variables we see a gap. And as you can see in the first three variables here, the wealth, household income, and earnings, you see a significant, in terms of the difference, the gap between whites and black in this. So here, for example, you can see that, and this is the unweighted sample. So you have that whites have wealth of 213,000, and blacks is around 19,000. So the gap is basically 193,000, and it is statistically significant. Similarly, you can find for household income and earnings as well. In terms of the household income, we added all of the income from the given household, and then in the earnings, it's just for the head of the household. You see also differences in terms of home ownership. So the gap between whites and black, it's 30 percentage points. And also, when you compare to Hispanics and Native Americans, you also find that for Hispanics, when comparing whites to Hispanics, you also see a wealth and income gap, household income gap. But those gaps are not significant when compared to Native Americans. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take this data and do our decomposition. And once we do that, we're going to be also controlling or using some of the weights from the American Community Survey. So before we go through that, we would like to show you also that the gap, it also remains in terms of if you look at the median wealth and household and earnings. So you can see that it's very comparable in terms of the gap percentage. So it's in the 90% or so. In this case, actually, if you look at the median for whites, whites and blacks, you see that it's actually about like 94%. So, okay. So first, in terms of the composition, we start with comparing two groups, whites and black households. And in this case, the group one, it's referencing the whites, and then group two is the minority group of interest. So if you see a positive difference, that means that whites have a higher wealth levels than the minority group of interest, in this case, blacks. And then we have decomposed into the explained and the unexplained. So you see that in terms of what is able to explain the wealth gap, we see that for the most part for wealth and for earnings, there is no necessarily significance, but only there is some significance in terms of household income. But once you go and analyze the unexplained part, you see that is highly significant across all of the different income, wealth and income levels. And that serves, again, as evidence of potential of discrimination. And in this case, the gap is 90% in terms of wealth. We conducted similar decomposition, but now we decided to conduct some robustness checks. So what we're trying to do here is to see if we are actually have this missing variable bias. So in this case, we are actually saying, okay, if we obtain the baseline that was given from before in terms of wealth, and then we add, we control for household income, which is actually one of the drivers of wealth, as well as home ownership and inheritance and exposure to incarceration. How does that wealth gap that we see, how does that vary? And one of the interesting things that we see is that the difference doesn't change much. You can see that it varies from, let's say, 213,000 to 216, but it's relatively similar. And it is statistically significant. And when you look at the unexplained factor component, you see that even when you're adding one by one individually to the baseline, is not changing the significance of the unexplained factors, which means that blacks face high level of discrimination in different labor, not only in different markets, so not only the labor markets, but also in any of the other markets that might impact wealth. Okay, so then in terms of doing the same analysis for Hispanic, we do find that there is evidence of a wealth gap and a household income gap, but not necessarily for earnings. However, we see that the unexplained factor is not significant for wealth, only for household income, and then when you compare to, in terms of earnings, you see no significance. So in other words, Hispanics do see some type of discrimination, but it's only, it's not as strong, let's say, in terms of for the wealth when compared to the discrimination faced by blacks. Then we conducted the same analysis between whites and Cherokee households, and what we find is that there is no gap, significance in the gap. There is a gap, but it's not significant. And then as a result, we also find no significance in terms of the different components. So which means that relatively to whites, Cherokee households tend to perform similar in terms of wealth and income and earnings. What we do see is that when we conduct the same analysis with Muskogee households, we do find a difference, a gap across wealth and household income. And the gap is actually the unexplained part or portion, it's significant. So what that says is that for Muskogee households, you see that they also face some type of discrimination as well. And that is the only tribe that we were able to find some significance in terms of the discrimination. So when we compare to other tribes, we find that there is no significant gap. And also when we compare to those that come from mixed tribal background or that have no tribal affiliation, we find also no significance. So just to conclude and share some of the implications of the analysis, what we do find is that blacks, Hispanics, and Muskogee they do face some type of discrimination, and that has contributed to the wealth gap that we see in the data. We also find that household income, particularly, and also earnings in terms of for Blacks and Hispanics, we find that there is a significant gap as well. When we compare, one part of the analysis that we did not show here is that we compare the analysis for Black and whites to the other NASC cities, and what we find is that for Tulsa, Tulsa has the largest Black-white wealth gap out of all of the other cities. And also, that particular gap is being driven mainly by home ownership and entrepreneurship, and Tulsa has, when compared to those other NASC cities, the largest gap in terms of home ownership and entrepreneurship. Here again, we interpret as evidence of discrimination that we find significance in the unexplained part of the composition. So with that, we're gonna now transition to the question and answers part of the panel. Projector. Yeah. How do we move it?
Oh, you can just go back to the first one. Just make it go back to the top.
Thank you, Rafi and Lauren, for that excellent breakdown. We're going to hear from some students in a moment, and we're going to try to save time for audience questions as well. But I just wanted to have a little bit of discussion about your findings. I guess what I would love to know first is, I don't know if being like on the ground in Tulsa was a part of your collection of research, but how do you imagine your report findings kind of influencing dialogue in Tulsa, efforts to achieve equity 100 years later?
Well, not just in Tulsa. I think it's very important for us to think clearly and understand what took place in Tulsa, and also the opportunities that were generated because of the oil boom. And put it into perspective, and then unfortunately the horrific events of 1921 that took place and how truncated the aspirations of many African Americans into achieving wealth and impacting society as a whole. So I think it's not just igniting the conversation and a proactive policy approach to energizing the local community. I think this goes beyond, it goes to speak to the whole nation, and for that, I mean, the entire globe, because I mean, it's very important to carry the message and to put it into perspective, so we as humanity, learn from these events.
Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
And I'd just like to add that I think, and this is true of all the NASC reports, but I think it's something that's also just exceptionally important about just seeing the numbers on the screen, right? Just seeing how large these wealth and income and earning gaps are and how they do differ across these different racial ethnic groups. And I think another important piece of it is also studying it at the racial ethnic group level as opposed to just the racial group level, which is something that, to my understanding, hasn't been done in any other like major survey. And I think that it really just shows you how stark those differences are. And I think that that's an excellent way to begin the conversation. Because the next thing is after you see those numbers is like, well, why do we see those numbers, right?
I'd just like to add that the Tulsa massacre was perhaps one of the more extreme, but it was only one of approximately 100 that took place between the end of the Civil War and World War II, in which white terrorists essentially assaulted black communities. for the purposes of preventing black political participation in the electoral process, but also for the purposes of destroying black prosperity. And in the Tulsa case, it was an attack on black prosperity primarily. I think it's really important to note then that Tulsa is not unique in the sense of it being an isolated instance
For sure.
of this type of a tragedy. But perhaps one of the most unique features of the Tulsa massacre was the actual deployment of decommissioned World War I airplanes by the white terrorists for the purposes of dropping incendiary devices on the Greenwood community. And I'm not sure that that's an act that was replicated anywhere else.
Yeah. I wonder, you know, I'm a journalist, and so if I were to cover this report, you know, I think I would immediately try to figure out if there is someone, some family, some business that is representative of just the gap. And I wonder if you encountered that in authoring this report, if you can kind of identify a piece of this, you know, living history that can connect today to 1921.
Well, we had the benefit in the class of the expertise and the passion of John Whittington Franklin, who gave 3 lectures. And he is the son of John Hope Franklin, who for many years was a faculty member at Duke. Also, John Hope Franklin is probably one of the nation's most distinguished historians.
Yeah.
And also, John Hope Franklin was the individual who headed President Clinton's national conversation on race. But most significant in the context of the Tulsa massacre, he was one of the litigants who brought claims forward for restitution in the 1990s as a consequence of the massacre. And he brought those claims forward because his father, Buck Colbert Franklin, was a lawyer who actually practiced in Tulsa at the time of the massacre, is the individual who wrote one of the most compelling eyewitness accounts of the massacre, and also is the individual who filed the claims, the insurance claims for the black victims of the massacre. So there's a very personal connection that John Whittington Franklin has to what took place in Tulsa. And you know, we really benefited from his insights and knowledge as this course unfolded during the semester past.
Has there been an estimate or assessment done of how much that family lost, and also just an estimate of how much black families in Tulsa lost in the aftermath of the massacre?
So I'm not certain about the personal losses of the Franklin family.
Okay.
But the estimate that I've seen that is most persuasive thus far of the losses to the black community collectively in terms of property, and this is apart from lives lost, but is in the vicinity of $620 million in 2020 dollars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So I perhaps know a bit more about the violence that happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where a mob of white terrorists also targeted black communities, and fatalities occurred. I think a lot of that history now is sort of discussed in a frame of the political moment that Wilmington was in at the time. With Tulsa, I don't know anything about the politics in 1921, but that economic moment really stands out, the oil boom. I just wonder if you guys could have, if you wanted to share a few more insights on how the oil industry and the, you know, very rapid accumulation of wealth in that city sort of contributed to and motivated what happened in 1921.
It's an amazing time in history, in the sense, prior to the massacre, not prior to the horrific events of 1921. But you see, and also, I mean, taking into account all the displacement of the Native Americans, particularly how, and that's an introspection we as a society need to exercise, in a sense that whenever we saw motivation for accumulation of wealth, right away that triggered that, it was already happening, but it increased in terms of the displacements of the Native Americans on one side. Mm-hmm. The second part is that you have a young, expanding economy due to the economic, the oil boom, which attracted many of the entrepreneurial spirit of any ethnic group, including the African Americans. Mm-hmm. And they benefit and they prove it. So once again, first, that serves as a testament that the African American community have an opportunity of growth, and they did it, and that's why the Greenwood neighborhood developed. No, unfortunately, with the massacre, I mean, that took place. It really created, disrupted that process in a way that is having an impact long-term, decades afterwards. I mean, a century after it. No? Yeah. The question is, how do we overcome that? First, I will reflect on it, do the studies, teach our students, future elected officials, future politicians, to learn about these stories, because we cannot afford for this to happen again, on one side. On the other side is to come up with very proactive policies to assist the populations that had the tremendous potential to take us all as a community, as a whole, as a nation, to the next level.
I'm not an expert on 1920s politics, nor am I a historian, so I can't, speak with specificity about the time. But I think there is something to be said for the fact that there was this large wealth shock across these different groups, and something about this tension and this competition for wealth. I think one thing that's really interesting is that when you look at what happened with the entrenchment of white identity in Oklahoma, is that there's this push to unite across different social classes of whites, right? And I think what it did is it bred this competition and this dislike of Black prosperity, because it messes with the kind of deeply entrenched idea of what the hierarchical system should be, right? And I think that's what spurred a lot of these different types of massacres, and why there was an intentional targeting of Black wealth, right? And as I recall, the beginnings of this massacre begin with what I believe is a falsified accusation of sexual violence that started it off, as is the case for a lot of those events that erupted around the United States. Right.
I would add one more thing here, and it's something that was emphasized by John Whittington Franklin in his presentation, as well as in an article by Ellen Nickmeyer that we cite in our report, and that's the fact that in the aftermath of the treaty arrangement that was arrived at between the so-called 5 civilized tribes and the United States government, an agreement was made that the tribes would allocate a portion of the land that was ceded to them after they were forced to relocate to the so-called Indian territories. They would cede a portion of their land to the folks who had been formerly enslaved by them. And it turned out that on that land, as well as land that was held by the native communities themselves, it turned out that there was oil under the land. And that was the foundation, according to John Whittington Franklin, for the wealth that Blacks held in the state of Oklahoma that fueled the growth of the Greenwood community. And so, as Lauren and Jorge both have just said, there was a competition for this wealth that was prompted by whites who believed that whites should be supreme. And I think that was the decisive factor that led to the massacre in 1921.
I would like to add that one of the, what I find surprising of that time period that kind of like reminds me of today is that even when you have like a wealth shock, it's not that everybody would benefit the same way, right? And you can see that, for example, nowadays with the pandemic, even when you integrate into the PPP, like the Paycheck Protection Program, right? So that is like a wealth shock to business owners, right? Because it was to help businesses to remain, to keep at least their labor force during the pandemic. You see that Black business owners were treated differently, even when it's supposed to be for all and in an equitable type of way. And so the Tulsa history actually emphasizes or represents the fact that even when you have this oil boom, that it was in the land of a lot of Native American tribes, the newcomers were the one kind of like that had these wanting to take over, right? And then that presented also issues in terms of like how are they going to divide the wealth, right? And that's actually something that you kind of like today, right? It's also represented in what we see today.
So that makes me think about what I wanted to ask y'all next, because I thought about asking what, after studying all these cities and writing these reports, if anything kind of surprised you about the Tulsa findings, but can I just say what surprised me instead? That the gap, the numbers between white households and Cherokee households is it's negligible compared to the other racial ethnic groups. I guess I wonder if you could kind of walk me through how those households or those generations of families were able to kind of recover and sustain their wealth when the other racial ethnic groups were not.
So one thing that at least when you look at the data is that so there's the argument made about like who owns the land, right? And then in terms of the new wave of whites coming into the Indian territory. So from that angle, you have that the owner of the land or the owner of capital would actually get the most of the returns, right? But even when you compare to the Cherokee to whites, that you still some type of difference, and it's lower, but not necessarily significant, right? And then you can ask in terms of if any other, because this is a snapshot of what it is in more recent times. So you can also ask about what is the other component of that wealth that is represented for let's say the Cherokee tribes. Like, are they now have a lot of their wealth, or through, let's say, the gaming industry, right? And those are some of the things that, for example, like certain populations or certain tribes are not necessarily have as many, let's say, casinos as some tribes. Like even within the tribes, you find differences in how they perform in terms of like the casinos and and how the wealth is distributed in the communities generated from those investment in the gaming industry.
And don't forget, we're presenting a snapshot of the last decade. But when you're asking about progression, that really entails a different type of study in terms of see the evolution of wealth for Native Americans from the early 1900s all the way through the end of the century and a little more. Okay. So at this point in time, it's just a snapshot. Yeah. So the progression would have been, I imagine, more painful as they negotiate the land rights and so forth.
So y'all heard that Sandy and I worked on a podcast earlier this year together called The Arc of Justice, now available wherever you get your podcasts. It was based on his and his wife's, very deep research into wealth inequality. And I just wonder, kind of after this topic has been researched and results have been revealed and researched and results have been revealed. You know, what might it take for that gap to finally be bridged between, especially between Black and white Americans?
No, okay. So that was a bit of a softball, I guess.
Well, I feel like I know what you're going to say, but I still want you to say it.
All right. Well, the argument that Kirsten Mullen and I make in our book is that if you are serious about eliminating this enormous gap in wealth, not just in Tulsa, but nationally, it would require a program of reparations that would be established for the purposes of having redress for this wave of atrocities that have taken place that actually created this huge disparity in wealth between Black and white households.
Right.
And then after that, you'd also have to consider like all the systems that are still in place that might drive that wealth gap to reopen even post-reparations.
Is there, to your knowledge, is there a reparations conversation happening in Tulsa?
Yes, and there has been a long conversation that has taken place in Tulsa. The original instance of a claim for redress was associated with the insurance claims that were filed by Buck Colbert Franklin. But in the 1990s in particular, there was an effort to obtain restitution that was conducted by something that was called the Reparations Coordinating Committee that was led by a group of attorneys, but it also included at the time the late Johnny Cochran as part of that team. Their claim was not successful. There appears to be a renewed effort now to make a claim. But there's not been any evidence of any significant success in making reparations claims through the court system. And so as a consequence, we argue that political pressure needs to be applied to the United States Congress. And I would say also that the effort to get reparations that focuses exclusively on Tulsa is problematic, because the repercussions of each of these massacres was not confined to the specific community in which the atrocity took place. We have to keep in mind that the Tulsa massacre produced a refugee population, just as the Wilmington massacre did, just as Ocoee, Florida's massacre did. And so those individuals who left the area would not be, it wouldn't be really possible or realistic to provide them with compensation if they're not part of the existing Tulsa community. It would be difficult anyway. But also each of these massacres had repercussions for other Black communities throughout the United States, where it became apparent that if you were highly politically active or if you had any visible displays of prosperity, your community was going to be in danger. And so there's a signal that emerges from each one of these massacres, which had national implications, not implications exclusively for the community where the massacre took place.
I'm super curious about this National Asset Scorecard. It just seems like a tool that maybe I should know about, more people should know about. Can you tell me anything about kind of that database, how it's maintained, and how you used it in this report?
Well, okay, go ahead.
All right, so the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Colors was just a series of telephone surveys that happened in 6 U.S. cities. And it was intentionally meant to mimic the PSID, which is like I think it's like the longest running national survey of its sort that collects detailed information on assets and wealth. And so it was in my opinion, it was really meant to capture like information at that racial ethnic group level, which had not been done before. And so it seems that the data, I believe, was collected between 2012 and 2014.
Yeah, for the most part.
For the most part, between 2012 and 2014.
The Baltimore study was a little bit later.
Okay, with the Baltimore study being a little bit later.
Yeah. but it was 6 areas of the country, 6 metropolitan areas. We would have loved to have done more, but there was a financial constraint.
Well,
Sorry, but that tells us how limited we are with some of the data sets that we collect regularly through ACS or through the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Bureau of Census. No? So you asked us earlier, what would it take to break this cycle, to really move ahead? I mean, a piece of it will be, yes, addressing all the biases and educating the general public through these reports and so forth, seeking some kind of financial compensation for all these atrocities in order to assist the population to get to that, to break that gap of income inequality. But the other thing is also to create these systems that capture this information on a regular basis.
yeah.
So we can keep producing this type of studies, and we can keep educating the next generations, and we can at least move forward from that perspective.
Yeah, we received a significant amount of support for these surveys from the Ford Foundation primarily, at the behest of a program officer named Kilolo Kijikazi, and she was essentially the angel behind the NASC project. But we haven't had the opportunity to continue that type of funding support from Ford or from any other source that would permit us to expand or extend the project to other cities. But I think it would be extremely valuable to get the same type of information about wealth disparities at this ethnic, national origin group specific level across the country. And it's certainly the case that the Federal Reserve, which conducts the survey of consumer finances, could do something like this at the national level, where they could look in a more precise way at specific national origin communities. But it would require them to put more funds into their own survey and expand the survey size.
So more angels needed.
Yeah.
This is my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to a couple of students. But I just wonder, as a body of work, have you all seen impact and action from the Color of Wealth series, from these studies? Tulsa just came out, but you have been doing this for a while in different places across the nation. Has there been?
Yeah, I think in several cases, local grassroots organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, have made strong use of the reports. And I think the report that probably has gained the greatest amount of traction is the one that was conducted for Boston.
Yep.
Where I think it's widely known now that the median level of wealth for a Black household in Boston at the time that we conducted the survey was $8. That's $8, right? And I think people frequently voice that statistic. They don't necessarily know that it's from one of the Color of Wealth reports, but I think that's a report that's been heavily used by local organizations in Boston for the purposes of advocating changes and improvements in conditions there.
And as you can imagine, it's a very labor-intensive task. From one side, from one perspective, being a fundraiser, then a social scientist, a researcher, produces the reports and then take it to the community, and take it to the community, to the different county councils, to the different cities, to the different universities in order to make an impact. So it's quite a task, but I think everybody is sitting in this panel are more than glad to take that challenge.
Yeah. Great. So I would just like to welcome Rebecca Barber to the microphone. Rebecca is a graduate student in the Master of Public Policy program at Duke, and she would like to respond.
Oh. You want to come to the podium?
Either way.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
Good afternoon. Let's see. For my research paper, first of all, I'm a public policy student, but I'm also a journalist. So I was really interested in looking into the role that Black women, and especially Black women journalists, played in helping to shed light on the massacre and counteract the dominant media narrative. And I became interested in this topic after reading an article in The New Yorker that really lifted up the story of Mary E. Parrish and Eddie Faye Gates. And as Professor Hollowell mentioned earlier, Mary E. Parrish wrote the first-hand account of the massacre, which was published a year later. And Eddie Faye Gates, in the 1990s, she kind of spearheaded an effort to bring together survivors who had been dispersed all across the country. And at the time, there were over 100. And I felt it was important to look at the stories of Black women journalists in particular, because they often do some of the work behind the scenes to uplift important issues. And also, like I said, I was realizing that a lot of the earliest and seminal works around the massacre were performed by Mary Parrish. And this is really important because at the time, the white newspapers in Tulsa, they were, if things had been left up to the white newspapers in Tulsa, much of the history behind the massacre would have been lost. It was the newspapers in Tulsa, mainly the Tulsa Tribune, that had instigated the massacre to begin with. As many of you know, some of the origins of the massacre was a false story that had been printed that a Black young man had assaulted a white teenager. So if it had been left up to the journalists at the white newspapers, not much would have come out of that. And also, what I learned from research is that there were 2 Black newspapers in Tulsa, but they were actually burned during the massacre. Just looking into that, I really began diving deep into specifically looking at Mary Parrish and Eddie Gates, like I mentioned. And like I said, one thing I found, Mary Parrish, of course, she documented firsthand accounts. So days after the massacre, she began talking about her own story, but also others as well. And it really helped to showcase the sheer terror that people were experiencing. And you can see even the difference. Eddie Gates, years later, she was doing her research in the 1990s, but people who were children at the time of the massacre were so terrorized that they were still terrorized. One person she interviewed was 5 years old at the time of the massacre, but still had images of white people storming into his house and setting it on fire. And that kind of really just speaks to the horror. And like I said, if it had been left up to the white dominant media narrative, then so much of it would have been lost. And in fact, in Tulsa, so much of it was not talked about, from the 1920s to the 1990s. In many ways, after Mary Parrish released her book, it was discussed among the Black community, and it was their way of knowing, what had happened and showing, their side of the story, but it wasn't known and widespread for years. As Professor Hollowell said, her story has recently been republished, and of course now, more people are talking about it. But I thought it was really important to just look at how Black women in particular were documenting beforehand. And so for me as a journalist, I am more so drawn to qualitative work, but I really appreciated how the report incorporated a lot of deep quantitative work. So given that, for years we've seen really deep qualitative personal stories about the harm of the massacre, and the report documents the quantitative work that goes really well and shows, the horror of the massacre and also the effects that still remain. So given that, on all sides, there's evidence, what do you all say to people that say that, resources are too scarce to provide reparations? And I know Professor Darity was saying it might not make sense to do it specifically in Tulsa when there have been other similar massacres all across the country. But in general, how do you all respond to the scarcity question?
Thank you, Rebecca. Does anyone want to take her question?
Well, just imagine, the social cost that was inflicted, and not just for that moment. Dr. Darity mentioned specifically an amount that some study produced in terms of estimations of the wealth lost during that specific time. But I understand the question in terms of, that there may not be sufficient funds, we cannot do it, it's not feasible. Having said that, not to really seriously do an analysis and attempt to correct the mistakes of the past will be setting us in a path that perhaps this can happen again to anybody. And once again, the social, when you start taking into account all the social costs, all the different variables, for sure it cannot be repaid. But to have a serious conversation and with serious analysis like what we're doing at the national level is something that we need to do.
Go ahead. Okay. I was going to say, my answer to the scarcity question is actually relatively short. My answer to the scarcity question is just that, in my opinion, this country has never been interested in trying to figure out how to put forth a reparations plan. So it's not, for me, more a question of scarcity, because we haven't gotten to the point of the conversation where scarcity has come as the result of the conversation. It's more so a resistance to even having a conversation and talking about how we could even go forth and to fund this type of plan, because it's not something that a lot of people are interested in. A lot of our political leaders are interested in. So the conversation hasn't gotten far enough.
Yeah, it's funny that Rebecca, you phrased it in the context of scarcity. I'm about to give an address to the Southern Economic Association in which I'm going to attack the premise that economics is founded on scarcity. But so I thought that was kind of interesting. But I think that what you're really asking is the question of how do we pay for it? Is that fair?
Well, I don't believe in the concept of scarcity. I was just saying, how do you respond to people that use that as an excuse?
Right, but I think ultimately they're asking, how are you going to pay for this big project? And I think it's odd that people still ask that in the aftermath of the immense sum of funds that was amassed to address the Great Recession, and the immense sum of funds that have been recently amassed to cope with the pandemic under the American CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. I mean, somehow the federal government managed to come up with these monies without raising taxes. So why can't that also be the case for a major reparations initiative?
And they came up with it fast. Yeah. Thanks again, Rebecca. I would love to have Donald Groh. Hi. Donald is a senior undergraduate studying computer science, and he's also got a response to the report.
Thank you all for having me and allowing me the opportunity to share some of my work with you guys today. So in the global research and inequality course taught here by Professor Darity and Hollowell, we explored wealth and income inequality and a lot of the effects that this had and that Tulsa had on the populations. And we saw a lot of the continuous issues that are even propagating until today. We read out these injustices and how it plagued these communities over the past century. And we studied institutions and their flawed governance, that led to the violence, and not only the violence, but also a lot of the inequality and the propagation of that throughout the last century. So considering this and overall my disappointment in the United States and like just in the fact that such an atrocity could occur and that we haven't really addressed it and it's been forgotten or at least overlooked for many years, I developed it had a pretty profound impact on me. So I thought to myself, knowing this detrimental effects and economic and financial implications of the Tulsa Massacre, how could I apply my knowledge of computer science here at Duke, as well as also an economics student, and to analyze ways to possibly mitigate and reducing income inequality today through changes in institutions and at least institutional structure. In addition to that, I also have a significant interest in blockchain as well as decentralized finance. So I decided to find a cross-section where I could link the two interests together to come up with a few methods of managing businesses and business entities today in society to just try to diminish the disregard of corporate ethics that exists today. So basically what I've came to in the overall analysis of this, of course, there are a lot of actually decentralized ideas and concepts that could help address this, but one that I thought to focus on specifically was the idea of using decentralized autonomous organizations as a model for maintaining and recollecting, maintaining corporate governance overall. So let me start off with explaining a little bit of what a decentralized autonomous organization is. This is a DAO. Generally, this is the governance structure that a lot of decentralized projects work upon, and that they're built upon, how they change over time. But let me start off with an analogy to explain this. So one of the best analogies that I've heard throughout my research of this is the comparison between the operation of a vending machine. As simple as that may seem, it's a pretty interesting analogy. So in the vending machine operation, you have to collect cash from the customers or some form of payment. Then there's the maintenance of the machine that's continuous. There's the distribution of the profits that are generated by the machine. We have adjustments in prices that are necessary. And then all of this is aimed towards providing a service that's done at a reasonable price level for all of the individuals that are involved. And so although the machine in itself operates in solitude, there are many components and many individuals, stakeholders that are contributing to the end product of providing someone a convenience of any goods. So now the problem that exists with having all of these different subsections and points of contact is that there's always human subjectivity that'll come into play, and also the error of human, of just possibility of different, just the subjectivity creates bias a lot of times. And we see this a lot of times more so in the larger, more important governance, institutions that rely more heavily on ethical governance. But what if there was a method of automatically directing all these tasks and making relevant decisions in a manner that best address the objectives of the client, the owner, and all the stakeholders involved? And that's kind of the idea behind a DAO, is that there is a set and discrete set of rules that all of the stakeholders understand and can view in order to see how the decisions are made within the corporation. So if at any moment any of the parties involved wish to change the margins on any of the products or any of the points of contact or the value added positions within the distribution of this product, they can be seen and they can be made, all of those changes. So let me go and give you a little bit of a broad overview of probably more the applications of this and the relevance to Tulsa, really. So as we saw, there's significant issues with that poor governance can have in propagating wealth inequality throughout generations. And so if we consider the dangers of this and like how this could occur from the institutional perspective, it really is just corporate oversight a lot of times that's lacking in the ability to manage these components, and also corporate structure that doesn't necessarily compensate automatically for the inequalities that might have existed. A lot of corporations today are profit-seeking. They have strictly profit-seeking motives that are not checked by all of the stakeholders involved. And we see that these are this obviously is problematic throughout Tulsa in the situation there that we saw. In addition to finance, so I'll just propose a couple of the institutions in which this is very applicable. First of all, in finance and insurance industry, I mean, as we know through the experience of Buck Franklin and some of the different conversations we had with John Hope Franklin, we realized that there was a significant issue with the distribution of funds within the insurance. So, and discriminatory practices in the issuance of insurance today. Now, let's take this model and try to see how we could apply it to decreasing these institutional issues within at the core of the structure of the institution, rather than making them strictly profit-seeking entities. Is there a organization in which we can have input and oversight, continuous oversight of the organization to make sure that all of the ethical concerns are addressed? And that's where the DAO would come in. If we had, and this is actually a very commonly proposed solution for banking as well as insurance corporations, is to apply a decentralized organization that would overview and allow for continuous auditing of all of the processes. Let's say in one of the biggest concerns, especially right now, regarding the applications of AI into making decisions for insurance, or even like bank providing loans and credit worthiness, is that there's a lot of the AI is developed as a black box. So one of the views is that you need to have some amount of oversight or a method of viewing what's going on in the decision-making process. And if you had now even as a lower corporation, they have significant. They can't really reveal a lot of their algorithms for the purpose of limited ability to limited intellectual property concerns. But if you have in the decentralized organization, you would be able to really show how these decisions, all the weights that are applied to different factors being made, accounted for in the decision-making process. So just overall, that's what I've explored throughout my research and experience, determining an analysis of the technology and how we could apply it to the different institutions that have propagated this inequality throughout the last century, and to come up with possible methods of mitigating this and at least slowing the further propagation. This kind of leads me into my second point, primarily upon the report and the review of the report, which I thought was an excellent report. I loved all of the the quantitative aspects of it, and it was really quite eye-opening to see the differences that actually appeared. And that kind of triggered one of my main secondary interests, I guess, besides the computer science, which is in the economics field, of viewing the difference, the importance, or at least the importance as well as the danger in this case of the exponential growth of wealth could have on the propagation of inequality and the creation of inequality over time. So, but I did notice one thing. I've studied economic growth classes here at Duke as well as worked with a couple of professors who study this ongoing. And we know that like in the economic, the growth of an economy overall, that it's like sigmoidal growth, in which you have somewhat of an S curve to it with a growing capacity on it. And one of the factors that really stood out to me considering Tulsa is that we were, and it's an overall inequality and discrimination that was occurring over the past, the 19th and 20th centuries, is that in addition to just this holdout of the exponential growth of general wealth, we also, there was the United States' main growth period was during the 19th and the 20th centuries. So there was exponential growth during that time period, especially in the 20th century. Whereas, so holding out on that, it brings back to the really one of the main, or one of the questions of reparations, which I think are extremely necessary due to this fact, is that if you even took and you eliminated all of the barriers and created some equality in the current state, like in the United States today, with all institutionally, like if you created it, there's still going to be there's going to be no way to correct for the, to correct and create equality, because across the board, that exponential growth period in the United States economy has been missed out by these communities. So right now, whereas all of the, like the groups in society that didn't experience discrimination are really, they're at the point where their wealth has grown. They took advantage of that curve because they were societally were allowed to. But now the expectation a lot of times is that, or at least, I mean, in the arguments against these, some of the arguments against it is that, oh, well, over time, if we correct the institutions, then the wealth inequality will kind of even out. There'll be like some kind of just, it'll occur naturally over time. But the problem is the growth, economic growth, is slower now today, and then really so those populations will never be able to experience economic growth. So in order to truly create, to me, the point I'm trying to get to in this discussion is that in the paper there was a discussion of economic, or the importance of exponential growth in wealth creation and the impact that has. But beyond just the lack of exponential exposure to that exponential growth, there's also a long-term issue with the fact that the time period has significant importance. Had there been that exponential growth today, and the difference was the discrimination was occurring today, you wouldn't see quite as severe of the impacts as had you had it during that time period of massive economic growth. So like the amount to compensate for that is significant and extreme, and needs to be done artificially, because you can't just expect it to naturally occur. Due to this, in a large part, not only because, and that was the only thing I was considering throughout the article, I was considering the importance of time period. Like it was such a core time period in American economic growth history that really limits the population. So considering all that, I did have a question regarding the article, and this was driven by one really important point that stood out to me, which was that the city, if you looked at the different national asset scorecards and the data for each of the cities, Miami seemed to have less wealth inequality. And I then thought about it from the perspective of how does the age of the city contribute to the differences in the levels of inequality? And I'm not sure if this is a question that you all considered, but to me it seemed like the younger a city, the significantly less, because there's a shorter growth period or time period for the wealth to grow. So the inequality doesn't have as much time to really separate.
Thank you.
Can I answer?
Yes.
So absolutely, I think you had a couple of questions that actually ties up the Tulsa report and what is the economy today. I think that one of your first question was, how can you use your skills, right? And I would say, come and become one of our RAs, right? So come and help us out. Because I think that at the end of the day, finance is going to play a big role in closing the gap. So even if it is through reparation, by giving, allocating reparations to Native Americans, African Americans, you would have to also create entrepreneurs to maintain the wealth in the community, right? So a lot of that is going to come through in the housing market. It's going to come through the stock market. It's going to come through the labor market. So finance is going to have that central role. And one thing that is happening in finance is that every now and then, and this addresses your generational wealth and growth point that you were making, is that every certain time period, there is a shift in the economy. So think of it as we went from agricultural to industrial to now more of an info or service type of economy. And in each of those stages, you have opportunities for regrowth of certain sections or part of the economy, right? So from that angle, I think that when you think about finance and where we're heading, like the new technologies and the decentralized way of let's say, building an economy that is more decentralized, it offers also an opportunity for different communities to actually get ahead on the curve, and also learning from the past. So now new opportunities coming from even from the regulatory perspective, I think that we have to be very vigilant to not repeat the same type of mistakes and to actually take into account the fact that different people come with different endowments in terms of wealth, right? So then once you move to the newer shift in the economies, you have to always kind of like checking for those. And I think that someone like you with your skill set and also with the knowledge that you have can actually help kind of like eventually minimize the wealth gap that we see today. And I think finance is going to be playing a central role.
So the exclusion of certain groups from the benefits of economic growth, particularly if we're thinking about the African American community that is descended from persons who were enslaved in the United States, the exclusion from full participation in the benefits of economic growth creates the basis for the calculation of the amount of monetary compensation that's due. And so the way in which you address the wealth gap is by addressing the wealth gap. Mm-hmm. That is to say, you pay eligible recipients an amount that's sufficient to eliminate the racial wealth gap. So I don't think that there's any problem associated with the past history of being excluded from the benefits of growth, because that's what goes directly into the calculation of the reparations bill. The other thing is, I'm not sure that DOA would address the reasons why black claimants for insurance payments were denied those claims. According to the insurance companies, the Tulsa Massacre was an act of God. So I guess you would have to find a way for your machine judge of claims to determine what is or what isn't an act of God. Maybe you can program it so it would not treat the Tulsa Massacre as an act of God, but the programmer would be responsible for determining what the machine does, and so you're dependent upon the judgment of the programmer, who presumably would be at the behest of the insurance company in the first place.
Could I address that point really quick?
We need
Okay.
to
You have some time,
move on
okay.
with our program.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry.
Thank you, Donald. Oh.
Okay, yeah, no, I was going to mention that one of the benefits of like in the application of the insurance industry would be more on the smart contract side, in which you'd have visibility. These are autonomously executable contracts in which if you pay, at the moment of paying into the insurance, you would have your set set events that would cause the payout. Now, the issue with Tulsa that we saw is really the stakeholders of the insurance corporations were the issue here, because they had some input onto allowing or denying claims. And same thing we experience today in the insurance industry is that there is ultimately someone responsible a lot of times for issuing or denying claims, or at least there's some set of rules that dictate this, but the execution of these rules is not set in place. The funds need to be distributed. So the idea is that you would have automatic distribution of funds associated with the events occurring. So if there was destruction, clear view of the destruction, then it would automatically start processing the claims, rather than even having to require for the individual to process a claim. Because I think that a lot of times as well, and we saw this throughout, that the claims processing, the process of doing that is actually limiting to the individuals who don't have access to resources.
Excellent thinking. To tell you the truth, it was you woke me up. I mean, really better than a cup of coffee. And I agree with you. But you mentioned it at the very beginning that every now and then you will have to adjust the weights. Remember, and you were talking about reevaluating the system to see if it's rendering the outcomes that we're expecting. So, as Dr. Darty indicated, you will have at that point in time you are adding a level of subjectivity.
You are, but
it
is distributed subjectivity across all the shareholders. It'd be as if today you had owned shares in any given organization, and then you would have input onto the organization.
Right. Nevertheless, I mean, it's an excellent point. To tell you the truth, I mean, I fantasize with the idea of replacing some elected officials with an algorithm, no? Or instead of having just an elected official, and maybe can we do an AI on some of those functions and let's see how that works. But having said that, I mean, once you have in some way, shape or form, the human input, then you will have the subjectivity. No?
Yeah, and I agree with that. The idea is just if you have distributed subjectivity, then it would lower the chances of any individual bias.
Excellent point. Excellent point. The other thing is, like, I wanted to share. You were talking about economic growth, you know, and how you were referring specifically about the rate of economic growth. There was a faster pace in the prior century than it is now.
Exactly.
Having said that, when you incorporate a segment of the population that have been neglected and didn't have the purchasing power to be actively engaging in the buying and selling of goods and services and so forth, you can ignite that business cycle in a way that renders prosperity. So let's not just think about the rate of growth. Let's talk about also the actual level of growth in terms of how the economy can expand by having all members of our community fully engaged, by having the necessary resources in terms of buying and selling and so forth.
Thank you.
Oh, and just one last comment on the question about economic growth and how does that feed into estimations for a reparations plan is one I'm in agreement with Sandy in that it would automatically feed in if you calculate the racial wealth gap now and you create a reparations plan to address the racial gap now. That would include the economic growth that has happened in the past. But I will say that it also could lead to like an underestimate of what the true reparations should be, because who's to say that those groups actually wouldn't have grown to have wealth past white wealth levels. So it is going to always be kind of like I don't know, like a top coded is not correct, but it's going to be it could be a potential underestimate of the amount of reparations that's actually owed.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that was my point if you assess it only based off of the like exponential growth of wealth, is that in addition to that, strictly, there's also a time component that there is missing out on one of the largest growth periods in the United States history, if not the largest growth period that the United States could ever experience. Just because like it was a time period in which there was like limited resource restrictions and the carrying capacity of capital and the labor was actually like still not met, whereas we're kind of getting to the point today, where it supposedly is it, and we're shifting towards like an increase in wealth that's driven by, or economic growth that's driven more by intellectual progression. There's like that's kind of what, that's the only difference that I meant. So it might be an underestimate. That's exactly the point,
Yeah.
that I think that doing it exponentially could be an underestimate.
Right, and I think the way that I would maybe like slightly rewrite that a little bit is not about tying a reparations plan to the level of like the growth rate of wealth, but it's tying it to the relative wealth position of whites. Right?
Today,
And yeah.
to compensate, yeah.
Right.
And that makes sense. Sure.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Donald.
much.
Thank you.
We are over, but do we have one or two burning questions from our audience? Would you like to step to the mic?
Yeah, I can also just project. Professor Darity, I know you mentioned a few lectures before, like you preferred measuring wealth gap in median versus mean.
No, I prefer the mean versus the median.
Yeah. In those summary stats that you mentioned, like were those mean or median? Like, can you talk a little bit about that and the choice you made with that?
I think they were means, weren't they?
Yes, in the
Yeah,
report,
and
we
I'm
mainly
going to let Rafi talk about that.
we mainly show the means, and then we did also provide a table for the median, because I know that also offers information as to how the distribution is how the distribution is. So, but all of the first summary statistics that we showed is the unweighted, and then in the decomposition we added the weights for the survey.
One more question? Okay, I think then we will take a break.
All right.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.